Thank you all for joining us tonight. If you don't know him already, for more than 4 decades, Brad Barr has been actively engaged as a practitioner in marine and coastal protected areas management and preservation. He received his undergraduate and graduate degrees at the Universities of Maine and Massachusetts, and his Ph.D. from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He is currently a senior advisor in the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries Maritime Heritage Program. For the past 13 years, he has served as visiting faculty at the University Center of the West Fjords in Iceland, teaching courses on marine protected areas, preservation of underwater cultural heritage resources, and Arctic ocean governance. He is also an affiliate professor at the University of New Hampshire School of Marine Science and Ocean Engineering, and has taught graduate courses at the World Maritime University in Malmö, Sweden. He is a member of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, serves on the IUCN Marine Mammal Protected Areas Task Force, and is a founding member of the International Committee on Marine Mammal Protected Areas. He has served on the boards of directors of the George Wright Society in the U.S., as well as the Science and Management of Protected Areas Association and the Coastal Zone Canada Association. In 2008, he was awarded a Partners for the Americas Fellowship conducted in British Columbia, focused on effective Indigenous co-management of protected areas, and in 2017, a Fulbright Research Fellowship to characterize and make recommendations regarding the preservation of the whaling heritage landscape of Iceland. He has also been chief scientist and co-principal investigator of a 2015 research expedition to the Arctic, a mission to map and document whaling shipwrecks in the nearshore waters of the Chukchi Sea, and serves as the mission coordinator in partnership with the U.S. Coast Guard and NOAA Office of Ocean Exploration and Research, locating and documenting the wreck of the U.S. revenue cutter Barr. He has published extensively on research focused on marine protected areas science and management, the identification and management of ocean wilderness, and place-based whaling heritage preservation. We are so thrilled to have you here tonight. Thank you so much, Dr. Barr.
I don't know about you, but it's always embarrassing when somebody reads one of those. I've been very fortunate to be able to have the opportunities to do so many of these things. So it's and almost all of them have been team efforts. So I can't take credit for a lot of it, but anyway, I am going to talk tonight about the Western Arctic and the demise of Yankee whaling. And in concert with that also the whale, particularly focusing on the whaling disaster of 1871, which is in the exhibit upstairs in one of the panels, and a really interesting lithograph that I haven't seen from Demise. Which looks like it was sort of enhanced with some painting, but a terrific lithograph that looks very much like what was in the, that I'll show you, that was also in the, has been published elsewhere. But anyway, and these, and what I say about nails in the coffin are really all about the idea that this was the demise of Yankee whaling, and there were certain key events that led to the end of Yankee whaling, and it all occurred in the Western Arctic. I have a tendency to ramble and to tell stories. And so I'm going to do what many historians, thankfully, what many historians do, which is to read the captions from, that I have, the script that I've written. I will attempt not to deviate from that because it's, as I say, I have a tendency to ramble, and we'll get through 5 slides and it'll be the end of the time together. So what I'd like to do is to, if you will indulge me, I'd like to be able to read this and provide the information that way. So I apologize if I'm not being extemporaneous, but actually I write better than I talk. So anyway, as all good stories, you have to start at the beginning. And for the Western Arctic, the beginning was this man. His name was Thomas Welcome Royce. Fascinating fellow. And there's a wonderful biography of Royce that if you can put your hands on it, it's out of print, but if you can put your hands on it, it's terrific. Royce had such a really interesting career. He was an innovator and inventor of whaling technology in the 19th century. He owned whaling stations in British Columbia and in Iceland. One of the stations that I was looking at in my Fulbright was a station that was owned and run by Thomas Welcome Royce and his brother. He was a keen observer of the natural world. His logbooks, unlike most, which just tell you the direction of the wind for the day and when they struck the sails or whatever, his logbooks are voluminous and incredibly detailed, but very much associated with what he saw. He was an entrepreneur and a pitchman. And you'll notice that in this picture, I'll just divert it a little bit by saying, you'll notice he doesn't have a hand. That was blown off while he was working on a rocket-propelled harpoon that he was trying to refine, and it never really worked very well. And he lost a hand in the process, but he was certainly dedicated to the innovations that really drove whaling past, globally drove whaling past the 19th century and into the 20th, and developed some technology that was absolutely essential. I won't go into that in great detail, but what I wanted to do and why I mentioned Royce was he was the first to penetrate the Bering Strait in 1847 on the bark Superior. He was a whaling captain, he was on the Superior, and it opened up this rich whaling ground of the Western Arctic. And the story of that event is actually very interesting because the whalemen that were on these ships did not want to go through the Bering Strait. They thought it was falling off the edge of the earth, not literally, but they just didn't want to go. And so Royce, it was foggy one June when they were there in the Bering Strait, and Royce just decided, well, damn it, we're going to go. And he didn't tell anybody, but he went below and got himself a brace of pistols, and he stuck them in his belt. And then he went back up to the wheel, and he gave the instructions and told them to sail. And now it was foggy, and they didn't know where they were going, so that was fine. But he was really concerned that he was going to get a mutiny, and so that's why he had the brace of pistols. And lo and behold, they came out of the fog, and they were surrounded by these fat, slow, really totally unafraid of the boat because they hadn't been whaled before. And this was the beginning of the bowhead whale fishery in the Western Arctic. I should say that within 2 decades, the bowhead whale population was cut in half. The whaling industry was very effective at taking as many whales as possible. And so, but this is the beginning of the story. Royce is central to all of this. And we're talking about the Western Arctic here. Crap. Sorry. I hate computers. Sorry. I'll get to this. So this is the Western Arctic. It includes the Chukotka, the Russian end of things, across the Chukchi through the strait, which is where that little angle is in the international boundary, up around the coast of Alaska to Wainwright and Barrow, over to Prudhoe, and during this period of time, there was also quite a bit of work in northern Canada that was done at Herschel Island. That was where they overwintered quite a bit. So there was that whole region was very, very important. And when I talk about the Western Arctic, that gives you a sort of a sense of context of what we're talking about. This was an image taken from the beach in Barrow, which was recently renamed, by the way, Utqiagvik. It's an Inupiaq name meaning a place to hunt snowy owls, and it was renamed to honor the Inupiat, who are the dominant culture in that particular community. and it was officially renamed. This is a picture of the ocean as it looked like, or the shore as it looked like in August of 2008 when I was there. This is what the whaling ship captains might have seen surrounding their ships during the disaster of September of 1871, but it wouldn't have been nearly as tranquil as this. This is just a bunch of floating ice. What they were facing was far worse, and I'll get to that in a bit. Why is the Western Arctic important? The area of the coastal waters of the Chukchi Sea saw the loss of approximately 50 whaling ships within a 5-year period in the 1870s. Within 5 years, they lost 50 vessels in that area. It's astounding to me that they continued to go back and go back and go back, but it was such, the returns, if you were successful, the returns were significant. The majority of these ships were from the important whaling port in New Bedford, a world away from the Arctic, but very much connected to it in many ways during this period. The decade of disaster has been widely attributed as one of the contributory causes of the demise of commercial whaling in the United States, which represented one of the most important elements of the American economy in the 19th century. And that can't be overstressed. Whaling was a major driver of the economy, and I'll talk a little bit about what the implications of that were when I get to a couple more slides. These losses were considered highly significant events in the history of American whaling, and this part of the Chukchi coast is of unparalleled importance in the global whaling heritage landscape. What might remain today of this shipwrecked whaling fleet was largely unknown before our 2015 survey. We saw this as a way to help write that final chapter of the story and to better understand if there was anything there that was worthy of preservation and what might be done to accomplish that. Whaling in the 19th century was one of, if not the first, truly global industry, providing oil to light the cities of the world. New Bedford, in fact, is called the city that lit the world. Paris is called the city of light, and it's not because they're jovial people. It's because Paris was one of the first cities that installed whale oil street lamps to curb the rampant crime that was going on in the inner city of Paris. And after Paris, many of these other urban centers in Europe installed these lights, and it curbed this problem with crime in the inner cities by having this street light. They lubricated the oil lubricated the machines of the industrial age, and I will divert here a little bit to say that as recently as late 1970s, the U.S. military was still buying whale oil, that is, sperm whale oil, to lubricate certain pieces of our ballistic missile system. I learned about this from a colleague of mine who had worked with the military a little bit, and they never made it quite public, but they continued to buy this oil because it was the best oil. And so anyway, the United States, which was the epicenter of this industry during this period, it influenced our diplomacy. It increased our knowledge of the remote corners of the world, particularly the seas that supported the whales we hunted. It drove the American economy throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, something like the internet today. It made the world just a little smaller because we knew a lot more about the world. It was a very mysterious place, the rest of the world, because we didn't travel nearly as much. The whalers brought back those stories about these exotic places they were at, and it made the world a little smaller. It broadened our knowledge of it. It opened the doors to these places through the press reports of the exploits of the whaling ships that roamed the seas in search of Leviathan. This is a map that's very interesting. It was done by Lieutenant Mowry from the U.S. Navy. It's a map that shows, it's a whale chart. It shows where whaling was occurring at the time. This was in 1851. Now you'll notice, just to point this out, if you look up at Bering Strait, you see that there's reports of whales that were caught in 1851 that when they only opened that area in 1848. Now, if you know anything about the way that we report like fisheries landings, it sometimes takes 3 or 4 years before we see the data from fishery landings that occur. And in this case, it was 3 years in 1851. So this was a pretty amazing map. I actually have a copy of this. It's hanging on my wall in my office. Very fascinating. But what you can see is there was a lot of whaling going on in the Pacific, particularly. And this concentrates on the Pacific area, but it also shows some of the Atlantic. And here's another map that was produced in 1887. Again, global, but it shows you that whaling was occurring all over the map, all over the globe. It was a big enterprise. And this was a really interesting piece of work that was done by Tim Smith and his co-workers that looked at, from whaling logbooks, they looked at catches based on the whaling logbooks, and then they charted all that in GIS across the globe. And it's an incredibly useful database that's now being considered important because it may be able to tell us something about where the most important areas are for whale conservation. I was just talking to somebody from the IWC, from the International Whaling Commission the other day, and they want to plumb the depths of this data because they think that maybe it will be helpful in identifying the places where conservation can be most effective. So this is really interesting, but the whole point here is just to say it was happening everywhere. And there was a tremendous amount of whaling going on. Given the many important ways that whaling shaped and influenced the US and the world's history, this is a heritage, I believe, worth preserving. As this is a heritage bound to particular places, the sort of place-based preservation and stewardship of our rich maritime heritage provides opportunities to find and protect these historically important places and the cultural landscapes in which they're situated for the benefit of future generations. All of these places have stories that resonate today, are relevant to understanding the endurance, adaptability, and resilience of our ancestors in confronting and overcoming challenges they face. There are many lessons learned that should not be forgotten, and we can help to guide and inform decisions that we make today when we face similar challenges. And as Santa Ana said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And that is, as I'm not an historian, but I deeply believe that because I see, as I study more and more history, I see us making the same mistakes. And we should be cognizant of this, and it should affect our education programs. We should be focusing a lot more on making sure that children understand the history of humanity. But I'll get off my soapbox. New England was Yankee whaling, obviously. It was the epicenter of the American whaling enterprise for most of the 18th and 19th centuries in places like Nantucket, New Bedford, and yes, Martha's Vineyard, which not only was an important port, that is Martha's Vineyard, but supplied a large number of whaling captains, officers, and mates for the ships hailing from the other New England ports. Thomas Stresser's book, Whaling on Martha's Vineyard, which I picked up a copy of and I was fascinated by, it offers a comprehensive and detailed history of these many contributions from the vineyard and from the people of Martha's Vineyard that's just, and I recommend it highly, as it chronicles the contributions of this island to the historic whaling enterprise far more eloquently than I could do here. One of the other places that's really interesting, and I've spent some time trying to understand the impact of whaling, was in Hawaii. Hawaii there wasn't a whaling location. It wasn't a whaling ground, but it was a stopping off point during this period of time from 1820 into about 1880. It was the major port in the Pacific. It was where all the vessels went to refit, to replenish their stores, to stop along the way before they went north to the Sea of Okhotsk or ultimately to the Arctic. Almost all of the whaling vessels stopped in Hawaii. And it enabled the whaling grounds of the Pacific, bigger ships, capable of longer voyages, and they needed to have this kind of a port. Led to Hawaii was strategically located to support this expanding industry. Its heyday was the mid-19th century. In 1922, there were about 60 whaling ships that stopped in the ports in Hawaii, and this was mostly Honolulu and Lahaina. There were 60 ships in 1922. In 1946, there were 600. The 1820s population of Honolulu tripled because it was driven by this economic development that was occurring where they had to build new infrastructure in places like Honolulu to support the whaling ships that were coming. So they built the first public water system in Honolulu that was really laid the groundwork for this explosion of population in Honolulu. It was all about the impact of whaling. And by 1860, Native Hawaiians comprised about half of all whaling crews in the Pacific and the Arctic. And remember that, because I'll return to that in a bit. Agriculture also changed to accommodate whaling. This is part of the impact of whaling on a place, on this cultural landscape, where they did things in their own ways. You know, they grew the certain things that they grew, and they did well. When whaling came, they had to change that. And there's an example from Dawes that I quoted in a paper that I wrote a while back. It says, one interesting example offered by Dawes in 1967 was the impact of changing cultivation practices related to increases in use for a period of time in the 1840s of the port of Lahaina. Maui had begun to grow white potatoes, which were favored by the whaling crews over the native sweet potato. Now, if you don't, it may seem trivial, but in fact, this was a major change that they did because the whalers wanted white potatoes. So they started to grow something entirely new, changed the whole landscape of agriculture in Hawaii, just because of the whalers. While there were other factors that contributed to the enhanced use of the port of Lahaina, particularly the more liberal nature of the port with regard to prostitution and grog shops. Now that Lahaina sported both the potato, as Dawes says, now that Lahaina supported both the potato and the prostitute, the commendation of these was all too irresistible for the whalers. And so much of the activity, the port activity moved from Honolulu to Lahaina during that period. And it ultimately came back. But Dawes concludes in the mid-1850s, the potato boom ended, but the prostitutes remained. Other things being equal, Honolulu's better shipping facilities prevailed again. So, you know, these were the kinds of things, the kind of changes in the culture that occurred because of the whaling. And I wrote a paper a while back that suggests that perhaps the whaling, because it had such a profound influence on the culture of Hawaii, I think that it had some contributory factor to the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy. You know, we went in and we basically took over Hawaii by force. And part of that was enabled by the fact that we had pretty much taken over Hawaii economically, both from the agriculture end and from the whaling end. And I think that whaling had a profound influence. I have colleagues who question that conclusion, but that's I stand by it. I think that there's something to be said in that. Whaling definitely left an indelible mark on Hawaii and its people. And we shouldn't forget the West Coast. There was actually quite a bit of whaling that occurred on the West Coast. This was in the latter part of the 19th century. San Francisco became the primary port, even more important in many ways than New Bedford. There were a lot of these shore whaling stations, like the one here at Moss Landing, which was torn down many years ago, and there isn't. I was out there, and there's nothing left. But there was a very large whaling station operation there. The West Coast also has this, and if you go up into Canada, of course, the British Columbian shore whaling stations were quite prevalent, and there's a number of those that are still there. Indigenous whaling is also being conducted as today by the Makah Nation in the Pacific Northwest in these waters established to preserve their cultural heritage. So whaling continues to be not only present but also an important kind of cultural issue. So why is this important? Why should we care? I mean, other than it's fascinating stuff and all of that. And I think the reason why we need to care is because it's still extremely relevant today. These are two images of activities that are associated with the Chukchi oil field. This is the actual limits of the Chukchi field. This is the proposal for a pipeline that would come in, and I would point out that where you see the word Wainwright is exactly where all of the 1871 artifacts are located that hadn't been found until 2015. And in fact, in the environmental impact statement that Shell conducted, they said that there was nothing there. So it didn't make any difference where they came ashore. So is it relevant? I'd say it is if we care about preserving the heritage. It also has some object lessons that are really important. This is the next kind of wave of going to the Arctic looking for oil. I mean, what was whaling? It was going to the Arctic looking for oil. What's this? This is the untapped reservoir of oil and gas that we're now exploiting. And so there really needs to be we need to pay attention to some of these lessons that we learned when we were doing the first round of going to the Arctic for oil, about sustainability, about conservation, and those are lessons I think that come from this story. And so the next big kind of event occurred during the Civil War, and this is the Civil War coming to the Arctic in the form of the Sea Raider Shenandoah. We know about the Sea Raiders. There were a number of them. It was the Confederates, part of the Confederates, this two-part naval strategy: defend the ports and commission privateers and Confederate naval vessels to attack the Yankee commerce. There was some debate about the effectiveness, but some had impact. And in fact, this is the CSS Alabama, which was lost off of France. But the Alabama was probably, next to the Shenandoah, was the most effective sea raider that the Confederates put out on the water. It was the last one that was commissioned was the CSS Shenandoah. It was arguably the greatest, having the greatest and most enduring legacy of the fleet. This is a fascinating story, and there's a book by Tom Claflin called Sea of Gray. That's one of about 5 or 6 books on the Shenandoah saga. But Claflin's book is particularly good, and I would urge you to pick it up if you're interested in this story. But the Sea King was bought in secret in England. It was taken to the Madeiras to be refit, and it was and then they loaded on the guns and the provisions and the Confederate officers and the crew, and it was renamed the CSS Shenandoah. And its orders were specifically targeted at the Yankee whaling fleet in the North Pacific, in addition to any U.S. merchant ships they happened to encounter. The whaling ships were targeted not just because of the industries important to the northern economy, but also because many of the sailors that were in the Union Navy were trained and taken as, you know, sort of seasoned sailors into the Union Navy. They were a core and a very important source. So if you could eliminate that source, it would also strike a blow. As I say, I'm not going to talk a lot about the details of this, but this is a map that from Tom Chaffin's book. But you can see where's the over here. They came out of England. They took a bunch of vessels, merchant vessels. They went around to Australia, stopped in Melbourne, and then headed north. And that's where the bulk of the vessels that they took were taken. But you can see the key events here. And then once they did all the damage they were going to do in the Arctic, they sprinted back back to London to surrender. Sorry, senior moment. And this was the beginning of when they started head north. It was the beginning of the Shenandoah campaign. They seized and burned 5 merchant ships vessels. You can see what they were doing. There was a lot of diplomatic pressure on the U.S. government by the U.S. government when they went into dry dock in Melbourne, but it didn't seem to do any good. In fact, they picked up about five new crew members. They went to Ascension Island, where there were 4 more whalers that were taken and destroyed. Then they turned north to the Arctic. They arrived in the Sea of Okhotsk in May, boarded whaler Abigail on the 27th. That was the first whaler they encountered. But she slipped away after large stores of alcohol found aboard were consumed by both crews. So that one sort of slipped through their fingers, but others were not so lucky. The attacks continued on the unarmed and somewhat unsuspecting whaling ships. And the key part of this story is this. The war was over. By the time they got to the Arctic, the Confederacy had surrendered at Appomattox. But there was no way of them knowing. First, they were on a secret mission, and so there was no communication with the Confederate hierarchy. And so they were out there with these orders, and they were pursuing these orders. And it was, they were unwilling to acknowledge the protests because all the whaling ships they encountered within this 7-day period from June 22nd to the 29th of 1865, they captured 24 whaling ships, 20 of which were reported to light up the sky of the Bering Strait. If you think about it, you burn a whaler, it's impregnated with whale oil. And the things they make incredible fires. And so anyway, they burned these vessels to the waterline. These 24, or some of the 24, they bonded 4. Bonding is a kind of a ransom by proxy. And what they would do is they dismast the vessel, they put the people back on board, and they'd set them off to drift. Or they put them in whaleboats, in the small boats they used to chase whales, and they'd set them adrift. Usually close to land so that they could sail or row in. Interestingly enough, no officer or crew of any of these ships captured by the Shenandoah was intentionally harmed. Nobody died. They were very careful about doing that. They didn't want to take life. They wanted to strike a blow to the whaling industry, which was so important to the North. If you want any measure of why whaling was economically important in this period, it's because the Confederacy went to these extreme lengths to strike this blow to something that was so valuable to the economy of the North. That was something that I think was really really important part of that. After Melbourne, just sort of in conclusion, 29 vessels were captured, 3 were bonded for $124,600 at the time, which was a lot of money in 1865 for the taken at Pompeii. So the remaining prizes were valued at $843,028. that are about 1.1 million in 1.1 million in 1865 would be on average about $1 billion today. So this was a big loss. And most of these vessels were from New Bedford. Because that was the epicenter of whaling in the United States. That was the epicenter of Yankee whaling. Mission accomplished. If they had a banner and they could have the president fly on board, they would have put up that banner. But then they realized that in fact the war was over. And so they were in a quandary because some considered them to be pirates because the war was over. They weren't doing something that was part of their military orders. So they sprinted 23,000 miles in 122 days. If you think about that, that's outrageously fast. And they surrendered to the English in Liverpool. And there was a whole more of the story that talked about the U.S. government and their relationship, that is, after the war with these people. And eventually the officers were pardoned because they didn't know that the war was over. But what a tremendously compelling story. And it has so many facets and so many interesting parts of it. And so this was the first nail in the coffin, was the Shenandoah. The second nail in the coffin was this disaster of 1871, where 32 whaling ships were abandoned in the span of about 7 days in September of 1871. 1,219 people were stranded. 31 ships were ultimately lost. Most of those ships were from New Bedford, but there were 2 ships that were from the Vineyard, one from Edgartown and one from Vineyard Haven. And there was also ships from California, from San Francisco, and there were some ships from Hawaii that were flagged. This was before the overthrow of the monarchy. But this was the beginning of that discussion. In 1871, these 40 ships from Hawaii, New England, and California had come to the area north of Wainwright Inlet along the Chukchi Sea coast in pursuit of the walrus and bowhead whales. The pack ice being close to shore that year left little room for maneuvering of the fleet. The whaling captains counted on a wind shift from the east, which happened on a regular basis, and because they were always trapped in the ice and then the ice moved off. But this year, it didn't happen. They were caught, and they knew it. They got together as a group. All 32 captains met. They said, we need a strategy because we're not getting out of here. And we have all these people on board. And it wasn't just crew and officers. It was also women and children, because at that time, because these were such long cruises, many captains took their families with them. And so there were children, there were wives, and they were very concerned about this. And so they decided that they would evacuate all 1,219 of these men, women, and children by way of the whaleboats. And this was an image that shows them making their way south in these small boats. These were relatively frail craft for this kind of environment. And this picture doesn't really show it, but there were wicked storms going on about this time. The boats constantly had to be de-iced. People had to pound on the rigging that was on these boats and the sails, and people were huddled together because they were way overloaded than what they usually had. It was it's just amazing that that they could pack that many people in. They dragged these boats across the ice, sailed them south, and rowed them to 7 other whaling ships whose passage was unhindered by the ice. They were below Icy Cape, which is about 70 or 90 miles south of there, and they were able to endure this difficult passage through these ice-choked and heavy seas. Fascinatingly, and I think the really compelling part of this is no lives were lost. Every one of the 1,219 people were ultimately taken back to Honolulu, where they were to safety. fascinating. I mean, that's what drew me to this story, was the fact that here are 1,219 people who suffered through tremendous, if you read the accounts, the first-person accounts, it's fascinating. These people were huddled together and trying to just stay afloat in these bad, ice storms and snowstorms and ice that they had to push out of the way. And despite all that, they all made it to safety. And this was not the last time that this actually happened, and I'll briefly mention this later, but in 1876 there were 24 vessels that were caught in the ice off of Point Barrow. In that case, they were all abandoned, and unfortunately there were 47 men who lost their lives in that 1876 event. But that was what constitutes kind of the third nail, was this loss in 1876. The disaster was widely reported. People were just fascinated by this, and even though there was no telegraph in Hawaii, this word every news organization had coverage, and there were articles in here. This was the New York Herald, but there was also one in the Hawaii Gazette, and people were just hanging on this story. So it was really widely reported. And one of the other things I wanted to mention about the 1,219 people, that 500 of them were Kanakas, were native Hawaiians. And this was part of the as many of you know, the whaling crews were very multicultural. But in this particular period of time, the native Hawaiians were making up large portions of the whaling crews of the ships that were working in the Arctic. And there's a long and really fascinating history of the relationship between native Hawaiians and the whaling industry. So anyway, I won't get into that, but there were not all the press reports focused intently on the economic losses as the whalemen's shipping list, which is the sort of the trade paper of the whaling industry. But clearly the whaling interests in New Bedford were profoundly affected by this turn of events. Without question, what happened in the 1870s in this remote part of the Arctic, that changed human history in a profound way, particularly leading to, at the time, the dominant whaling country no longer pursuing whales. These nails in the coffin were getting pounded in tighter, and the top was getting pounded in tighter and tighter. And you can see the kind of losses that we're talking about here. Again, $33.3 million in 2013 dollars. It was probably even more. I think this is probably underestimated. And some of the other coffin nails that I talked about were this 1876 disaster. And I mentioned that 300 were stranded, about 50 people died. It was a big, another great loss. And then finally, in 1859, was the discovery of oil on land in Pennsylvania, Titusville, Pennsylvania. And this was a big, one of the bigger nails that got pounded in. It took a while for them to pound it in, but eventually production increased in Pennsylvania, and whale oil no longer was needed as much, so the economic viability of the industry tanked, essentially. For a while, towards the end of whaling, all that was being taken from whales was the whalebone, was the baleen, because that was what was still valuable. But guess what? The coming of other materials, like the beginnings of plastic in the early phases, made that particular, the value of that particular commodity go down too. So there was just no need to continue to whale when there were these other products. But perhaps more importantly, the whale populations across the globe were severely depleted. Whalers There was no place for a whale to run and hide, because if there was whales, there were whalers, and the whalers were very good at taking whales. So all of these populations were depleted, making whaling far less viable. And the Western Arctic was the last frontier, and when that was exploited, there was just no going back. And I'll just briefly mention this story because I think it's fascinating. But this is another story that occurred in 1897 1908 called the Great Reindeer Rescue. And there's a book by John Taliaferro called In a Far Country, and I'd encourage this because it's a really good book. It's very easy to read, and it's all about this thing that occurred when these whalers were stranded. They got them to Barrow, and word came through that they didn't have enough to eat, and so the Coast Guard or the Revenue Service on the U.S. Revenue Cutter Barr decided that they would take reindeer that were being husbanded in Alaska, having been brought from Chukotka, and to start this new industry of reindeer herding. And they were going to take 500, I think it was 500, whatever it says, 400 reindeer, and they were going to drive them in the depth of winter. They drove them from Point Hope, I think it was Point Hope. It was 1,200 miles. And they drove them 1,200 miles in the depth of winter to Barrow so that these guys would have something to eat. The twist to this story is that it was a great caribou year in Barrow, so they had plenty of meat. But that was never, it turns out that was never talked about because this was such a heroic feat that what were you going to do? Say, well, thanks guys, but we have enough food, right? So anyway, and it turns out that Jarvis, Lieutenant Jarvis, who was the XO of the Barr, was the name of the highest medal of heroism for the Coast Guard is named after Jarvis. So very interesting story, and again, I encourage you, if you pick up a copy of In a Far Country, it's a great read. So we wanted to talk a little bit, and I'll try to move a little faster. I'm sorry that I'm diverting a little bit, but these are fascinating stories. The 1871 disaster was particularly interesting to us, and so we had seen that there had been some work before to document this. There was a guy by the name of Randy Beebe who was funded by Nat Geo to go up and look at the shore wreckage, and you can see from the pictures that there was a lot of wreckage that was here. Now remember that in 5 years in 1870 there were more than 50 vessels that were lost in this area, right? So, and that was the only kind of vessel that was lost there. There weren't merchant ships or anything else, there were whalers. So every piece of wood that you see on the shoreline came from one of those whaling vessels. We're very confident of that because there just aren't any other vessels that got lost there. So these are all whaling vessels, and they documented this thing. They tried to do what we had ultimately went back to do. They were towing this tiny little side scan sonar, this acoustic sonar, and I got that picture there were actually about 7-foot swells, and we would lose sight of them while they were in this tiny little inflatable towing this little thing. It was just they weren't set up to be able to do what needed to be done. And in this case, what needed to be done was to do a kind of a survey, a survey of the seabed of the areas just offshore where those whalers were lost. And so in 2015, that's what we decided to do. This is an area that BB. All of these little orange dots are places where they found wreckage. They documented it. So there was a lot there. When we went up in 2015, most of it was still there, although Wainwright is filled with a bunch of houses that have large beams in them. The Inupiat are frugal people who saw that instead of paying hundreds or even thousands of dollars for wood shipments, they could go out and they could harvest the wood from the wrecks and put them and use them to build their houses. And that's what they did. And so all through Wainwright, you go in and go into somebody's house and they'll show you, the beams that they got off the whaling vessels that helped them build their houses. Fascinating stuff. So anyway, so this is what BB did. We went back, given the fact that there were these 50 documented ships there were 75 documented between 1850 and 1900 in this very discrete area of the Chukchi coast. We assembled a team of experienced maritime archaeologists and seabed mapping experts and went to the Arctic looking for whaling shipwrecks. To accomplish this, we needed to have the services of a charter vessel. I can tell you that I've done a lot of chartering around the United States and in some other places. This is the only vessel that was available in the Arctic. There just aren't charter vessels. And fortunately, it was a very good one, but it needed to be able to operate in shallow water. It needed to be able to support very sophisticated seabed mapping technology. And it needed to have a captain that knew what he was doing, these waters very, very intimately, because there aren't ports. You have to sneak in, and there were times when we were taking the Yupik over sandbars, and you could see it, churning up the sand because there wasn't any water, but we needed to get away because there were, 6 to 8 foot seas, 8 to 10 foot seas that we were struggling with. We could map in 6 foot seas, but when it got to be like 8 to 10, 10 to 12, it was impossible. So you needed to have all that, and we were very fortunate to find it. This is the survey area that we were working in. This is a place called Point Franklin. Wainwright is down here, here. This is just a piece of it that we did with the multi-beam side scan. This is the entire area from Point Franklin to the Wainwright Inlet, which is one of the villages up there. The map gives you the location. That was what we were surveying. The approximate depth in the survey area is 28 feet. Now, if just so you understand why that's significant, if you're doing acoustic mapping, shallow water is really, really problematic, because what it does is you have an instrument that's producing a series of acoustic signals, and it's in a kind of a wedge, okay? And if you're in deep water, that wedge spreads out and you can cover a whole bunch of area. But if you're in shallow water, that wedge is very small. And so you have your line spacing, that is the lines that you have to follow in order to cover the bottom in a comprehensive way, that line spacing becomes very, very small. So you have to go back and forth, but you can't do that. A kilometer to the next kilometer, it has to be like 400 feet or 300 feet in order to be able to do that. So it's a very difficult place to map. And this was approximately 37 kilometers along the inlet. The mapping technology that we used, it was underwater acoustic mapping. We used this multi-phase echo sounder, which is a side scan and multi-beam, which is just a different kind of acoustic sonar. We used the Edge Tech also. And we also did magnetometry. And this is a magnetometer. It measures things that are magnetic in the seabed. And this base station is important. And the magnetometer detects metal artifacts on the seabed about a couple of meters on the seabed and a couple of meters into the seabed. Okay, so it penetrates, and the way it was set up with this base station, which measures the changes in the Earth's magnetic field in the area. And what you do is you compare that to the data that you're getting so that you can make it more, give you better resolution. And with that system, we could see things that were about the size of a golf ball. So it was pretty useful, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But this was the kind of technology we were using. We also used a drop camera system that I'm proud to say I designed and constructed, which is pretty good for a silly biologist. But it was a system that you just drop down to the bottom and then you drift. Or we found that we put a wing on it and you can actually drag it around, and it tracked pretty well. So And it had GoPro cameras on it. It had this camera, which gave us real time, so you could actually see what you were looking at on the bottom. And then it had a bunch of lights, but it had downward-looking, forward-looking GoPro cameras that recorded. And I'll show you some pictures that we took. But it worked pretty well, actually, even though I built it. So this is the area that we surveyed. It was both magnetometry and acoustic images of the seabed were collected. Since the sun never set, the great thing about working in the Arctic in the summer is the sun doesn't go down. So you can work 24 hours. And we did. We had enough people on board that we were able to map 24 hours. And given the depth, that was really important that we were able to do that, because if we hadn't done that, we couldn't have mapped the area that we mapped. There was just too much to do. I mean, and basically what we were doing was in very long transects. We'd start from one end, go all the way down to a certain point, turn around, go 300 feet or so away from it, and do another one that was parallel to that until we got, it's called mowing the grass by the seabed mapping people. And so we mowed the grass and we got quite a bit of information. So what was accomplished? Well, we got in the 2 weeks that we actually had allocated. And about half of that was weather days, because the weather was so snotty that we kept having to tuck into this place called Purd Bay, very shallow. I mean, you could walk through some of it. But the captain knew the places that we could hide. And it turned out that, and if you go on the web page for the Lost Fleets Project, I did a kind of a report that was videoed, that's on there, that basically said, you know, what's really fascinating about this is we're at the same place that these whalers were. This is where they took the whaling ships, and we were sitting in that same place. And I gotta say, it was just awe-inspiring. You know, that we were in the same place that they were, hiding from the weather that they tried to hide from. You know, it was terrific stuff. Anyway, so we got about a little less than 50 square kilometers of seabed. We discovered 6 pieces of wreckage on the seabed with the acoustic sensors, and we identified 3 areas from the magnetometry that are likely to be pieces of wreck that are buried in the seabed. It's a very highly dynamic environment, and a lot of those areas, that wreckage was buried because there's the USGS has determined that there's something like a 10 meter loss of shore. The shore is being eroded by 10 meters every year. So that's a lot of sediment that's being transported. And plus, I'll get into a little bit more, which becomes important, but there's an offshore bar that's also being distributed that way. So a lot of stuff is being buried, maybe exposed, but for not very long, because the next storm that comes along, it gets buried again. But anyway, these are the kinds of pictures that we got from the acoustic sensors that we were using. We were shocked that we found something, because this is in an area that's in 20 feet of water or less in some cases, and there's something called fast ice that occurs along the shore in the Arctic. It starts freezing from the bottom and from the top, and it eventually comes together so that the whole water column is frozen. And then it kind of breaks up, and then it moves around as the winds push it. And so if you think about that, and you think about those pieces of ice that are going back and forth, there's a lot of, in that, the seabed, you can see a lot of gouges from that. But we never expected that we were going to see, intact pieces of wreck. And it gets better than this, but this was one of them. I'll only show you 2. There were 6 of them that we found that were kind of like this. And they're definitely parts of whaling ships. We don't know which ones, but we do definitely know that that's the case. This is another one. The picture's a little hard to see, but this is, it's got keelson floors and bilge ceiling. It's got iron kettlage present along with an anchor, a chain, a dead ice drop, and tryworks knee. I mean, this was an artifact field that was retained after 144 years of this fast ice moving back and forth. Fascinating stuff. So this is what some of the pictures look like. What's the interesting one here is this one. You'll see it's got a little rust in it. These are iron bars. And it was very unusual for a whaling ship to carry iron ballast. This was something Navy ships did. But whaling ships sometimes carried them. And we were hoping that we were going to be able to identify the vessel on the basis of some record of one of the whaling ships carrying iron ballast, but we couldn't. We went through the primary literature, all of the information that we could gather from the New Bedford Whaling Museum, from Mystic Seaport, from all of the sources of that kind of information. We couldn't find it. But the fact that there were iron bar, that's something that, sooner or later we'll come up with a source that's going to tell us which vessel that is. Okay, very brief, but you notice, I'll play it again. Watch it, it's very brief, but you can see the anchor. Now what's interesting, there may be a second anchor under that's sitting like this, with this anchor, like this, but what's interesting about this is that that anchor's sitting up, basically up, leaning on the side of a piece of wreckage. And so, how could that be when this fast ice is moving all the time? But it was there. We still don't have a good explanation of that, but it was there, and it hadn't moved in a very long time. So it wasn't like anybody was out there, kind of moving stuff around. It was there. This is another longer video of a bigger piece, and I'm hoping that it'll go all the way to the end. You can see all the beams and things, and then here's okay, and you can see, you saw the pieces, and I'll go back and show this as an image, but you can see the ice anchor, and these are ice anchors. They're not anchors for the vessels. They were anchors that was used to hold the vessel to a piece of ice so that they could cut into a whale, or in this case, so that they could, not have to move around when the ice was moving around. So anyway, there were these ice anchors. There's a piece of chain in here. There's some ballast, a couple of ballast stones, a couple of other things. And if you look at the wreckage, this is a location. That location was called WNS2. And you can see there are anchors. There's the anchor. There's the chain. I didn't mark that in. This is called a rigging strop. It's part of the rigging of the vessel. And this is called a try-works knee. And these are all pieces that are indicative of 19th century whaling vessels. And if you want to get the sense of what a try-works knee is, you go back to the only existing whaling ship, the Charles W. Morgan out of Mystic, and this is what a try-works knee looks like. It's what held up the try-works where the blubber was being rendered. So that's what we were looking at. That's what this is. Clearly. So pretty amazing. And I mentioned the magnetometry. This is what you get from a magnetometer. Doesn't mean a lot, except every one of these little dots is a piece of metal that's at least the size of a golf ball. So, and if you look at this and you do an analysis of the data, it turns out that there are concentrations in this area. And I think in the northern area, which is what this is, I think there were no specific sort of concentration areas, but there were a lot of pieces of metal. And if you think about a whaling ship, what do they? I mean, they have lots of metal on them. I mean, they all had. Sorry, senior moment. The guy that makes the iron stuff. Blacksmith. Thank you. They had blacksmiths on board. And so, that was because there was so much iron on those ships, even though they were wood. So, there's a lot of iron here. This is in the point from Point Belcher to Point Franklin. These are concentration areas. And if you do the analysis, it turns out that there may be wrecks that are buried that all we're seeing here are the pieces. So we don't know whether there's an intact wreck, but there's certainly big pieces of wrecks that are buried in this area based on the magnetometry. You remember I talked about the protective shoal, and this was a part of the story that no one could explain, because if you look at the pictures or the images that were generated, this lithograph from Harper's Weekly in 1871, which showed this open bit of water and then the shoreline. Nobody could figure out why the ice was piled up out there. And so the presumption was that, and these pictures were based on first-person accounts, so it's not something somebody was making up. There was open water, and in fact, there's another one from these paintings that were done that also show this part of open water. And this protective shoal is actually pretty important, because if in fact it was it was because of this Barr, it was the way that they were able to save 1,219 people. If they had to go through ice in order to get to Icy Cape and the waiting whaling ships, they never would have made it. But this Barr that we found and is quite present in many places, is probably the reason why they were able to escape. And this was part of why we went, was to try to tell the final chapter of the story, try to answer those questions. Not just was there anything there. That was an important one. And remarkably, after 144 years in the survey area exposed in the seabed, there was wreckage. Our archaeologists were predicting, when we first did this, when we talked to the maritime archaeologists, they were saying, there's going to be nothing there. It's fast ice. What's going to be there? And not being a maritime archaeologist, I didn't know that was impossible. And so I spurred on for a while until I got everybody on board and did this. There's more wreckage likely to be present, but it's buried in the seabed. And what we did with this was we provided all of that data to the State Office of History and Archaeology, which under the National Historic Preservation Act is responsible for protecting these resources when they are identified. So we identified that there were resources out there that needed to be preserved. And interestingly enough, immediately after the mission, the Office of History and Archaeology coordinated with a company that wanted to put a fiber optic cable in. And they were going to go right through this area where all these resources were, and the state of Alaska told them, no, you've got to move them you got to move it a little further offshore. And so that sounds really good. I want to say, by full measure of disclosure, it turned out that the CEO of that company was I later found out, was arrested for fraud, that they had no intention of putting a cable in. So maybe it wasn't the victory that I really wanted it to be, but it was. But the idea of it was at least what we were trying to achieve, and so that was I think the way that we hoped that we would make this happen. And these are the people that did this. We had a great crew, people not just from NOAA. Matt Lawrence is now the maritime archaeologist in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. Vitad Pradith and Evan Martial both work for companies, and they donated the people and the equipment in order for us to do this project. So we were really grateful that, because we couldn't afford it. I mean, we had just a little bit, we had less money than it takes to go to Nantucket than we did to go to the Arctic. But we were able to do that because of these people. And then the second leg of the cruise had the maritime archaeologists, and those are the people that identified the resources that we found. And it was a tremendous kind of capstone to my own career, but it was I think that it was extremely valuable. It did generate quite a bit of information that I think is ultimately going to be important, at least now people know that that coast is not just barren sand, that there are resources there and they matter. And that's going to be helpful in the future. You know, we know that the Dutch Shell has drawn back from exploiting the Chukchi oil field, but that's not going to last forever. And so now they can't write in their EISs that there's nothing there. And I think that's a really powerful tool. And I think it's something that we learned from the historic whaling, that these are the kinds of lessons. You need to have good information. You need to pay attention. You need to pay attention to the Inupiat. You know, one of the parts of the story that I didn't tell was that the Inupiat, when the whalers met with them in 1871, they said, "Oh God, you guys got to get out of here. It's going to be terrible this season." And they said, "Oh, you know, it was a terrible season. It was, you know, millions and millions of dollars in losses. They should have listened to the Inupiat, but they didn't." And we have a similar kind of situation now where we should be listening to them, because the Inupiat of the Arctic have a long and deeply important and meaningful whaling heritage. And that continues today. They're one of the groups that has indigenous whaling rights, and they do it. It's a very important and essential element of their maintaining their culture and their traditions. And this whaling is an essential part of the whaling heritage landscape of the Western Arctic, upon which the history of Yankee whaling is superimposed. They were whaling up there centuries before the Yankees came. And so we need to recognize that. We need to pay attention to that. And, you know, I don't, out of respect, tell the Inupiat stories out of respect, because those aren't our stories to tell. But I hope someday the Inupiat share those stories and are able to weave those many threads into the rich tapestry of whaling heritage in the Western Arctic, because I think it's really important. So if you want to learn any more about this, you can always get a copy of our paper, which is, even though it's a scientific paper, it's eminently readable. There's also tons and tons of stories about, written material about the 1871 event, but this talks about the survey that we did in 2015. There's also a web page still up. It's still receiving a tremendous number of hits on the website from the 2015 Lost Whaling Fleets expedition, and I'm gratified by that, because I think that it was it's kind of validation that we actually were up there doing something useful. So that's all I have. Thank you. I'm sure I've gone over. I'm sorry about that. And I thought, I don't want to keep anybody longer than we have to, but if anybody has any really pressing questions, I'd be happy to answer those. Otherwise, I'll hang around and I'd be glad to talk to you afterwards.
You have 3 more hours.
I wish I had 3 more hours. I've got a lot more stories to tell. I haven't even got started into the work we're doing now, looking for the revenue cutter Barr, which is a really exciting project, and you'll be hearing, I'm sure, more about that. We're headed back out to document the location. We will discover the revenue cutter Barr, the final resting place. That will be a very big thing. Yes, ma'am.
In the painting of the people leaving in the whaleboats, there were in the background, it looked like whale ships burning. Is that what they were?
Yeah, this is one of the sort of interactions that occurred with the Inupiat. When the whaling ships were, sorry.
Can you bring that slide back up?
Sure.
Yeah, it'd be fine. I didn't want to
let's see if I can do that. I know I can do that here someplace. Like this one.
Did they deliberately set the ships on fire?
Well, there were a couple of them that they did. And what had happened was, when they abandoned the vessels, the Inupiat, being good privateers, just like people from Martha's Vineyard in the history of Martha's Vineyard, went out looking for things that they could take off the ships. And they found they had taken all the alcohol off with them when they left. Actually, they poured it out. They didn't take it in the boats. But what they found were a number of medicines, which when they drank, thinking they were alcohol, killed one of the Inupiat. And as retribution, the village rose up and they burned a number of the vessels. And then they took off for the hills. Well, whatever constitutes hills in the Arctic. But they left because they were afraid of retribution.
Sure. I wondered if the whalers themselves burned their vessels to keep people from...
Well, no, because there was always the hope that they could come back and salvage them. And in fact, there was one vessel that was ultimately salvaged, taken back to San Francisco.
But after the thaw?
Yeah, the next year, in 1872, there was a rescue mission, or a kind of another privateering mission, if you will, where they went up looking for vessels that they could take. They abandoned their, all the barrels of oil that were in that. So they were all those barrels of oil were still theoretically there. And if they could go up and load a ship with the barrels of oil that were abandoned, that was that they could make a hefty sum out of that. But the other thing that happened was when they abandoned, sometimes they didn't put out the fires. The fires that were burning. So if they were cutting in a whale and they were burning, and the try-works was still going, it could have gotten out of control. And there were a number of vessels that burned that way, not just in 1871, but it was a constant problem on board these vessels.
Oh, they would catch fire.
Because they would catch fire, and there were a number of them that caught fire as a result of those vessels those fires not being put out when they abandoned, because they had to go really quickly. I mean, these vessels, if you read the account, the vessels were being holed. They were being squeezed by the ice. The timbers would break. They'd start to take on water and they start to sink. And this would happen very, very quickly. And so many cases, they weren't ahead of it enough that they could get off. They could only get off the most essential, their most essential gear, their whaleboats, and themselves. So there was a lot of stuff on those boats that ultimately either the Inupiat took and stowed away, took to the shore, or it was taken, or it was just simply lost. I mean, I would guess that one of the things that we didn't see are the remains of the barrels. But we saw in a number of those, the pictures I didn't show you, we saw a lot of barrel hoops. And so my guess is those barrels probably degraded over time, but they could also have been just simply barrel hoops that were on the vessels, because they carried a whole mess of them, because they built all their barrels on board.
You don't think the Inupiat would have taken the full barrels?
Well, they did take some. And in fact, when they got there in 1872, there were piles of these barrels of oil on the shore. Some Inupiat wanted to protect them, and some Inupiat were running away because they were afraid of the retribution from burning the vessels. Yeah.
That's what they had a right to.
Yeah, exactly.
But since the artist painted there's 7 ships burning there so deliberately, I figured it was a very deliberate.
Yeah, although I'm not sure that may be.
You don't think that's ships burning?
No, what that may be is fires on the shore, because you're looking from the sea to the land, and they built. I didn't look close enough. Those are fires of the people who are staging. You see all the boats here along the shore. They were on shore. They built fires so they could warm up, and then they went back out into the lead, and they went. So yeah. So that's what that was. But the other story was interesting too. So. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Just wondering, is it a coincidence that Captain Douglas has 2 vessels named Alabama and Shenandoah?
Yeah, we were having lunch at the Black Dog, and I looked up and I saw Shenandoah in Alabama, and I said, "Oh, I'm going to talk about those boats tonight," but not those boats. But they were very, very famous. I mean, the Alabama took almost as many boats almost as many merchant vessels as the Shenandoah did, and it was. There were a number of stories written about the Shenandoah and the other sea raiders. There were, I want to say 7 or 8. So there were a whole bunch of them. There's a really good book on the sea raiders. I don't remember the name of it or the author, but if you look on the web, I'm sure Amazon has 15 of them that are like that.
To answer Brian's question, however, as an ex-mate on Shenandoah, I can say that Bob named the schooner Shenandoah because he loved the song. Which is, the Indian translation is Daughter of the Stars. That's what Shenandoah means.
Oh, interesting.
And Alabama was built to be a pilot schooner off of the port of Mobile, Alabama.
She was
So she was named Alabama. because
Oh, okay. Well, very good.
But what a coincidence.
But what a coincidence, yeah. I mean, I was certainly shocked. I mean, I haven't been back to the Vineyard in, I don't know, 20 years. So when I looked up and saw that, I said, boy, things have changed.
I bet it was a southern boy.
Yes, sir.
So, in your description of your plotting of all of the sites and the various things that you found, where would the coastline have been 150 years ago if it's receding at 10 meters a year?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there has been some work. There was actually some work that was being done, that was published in 2015 when we were doing the survey, that was done by the Corps of Engineers, or I'm sorry, the U.S. Geological Survey, where they were looking at this, and there were places. See, the problem with numbers like that is that it's not everywhere that there's 10 meter erosion of the seabed, of the shoreline. Some places there are, it's accreting. Some places it's eroding. In that general area, I looked it up because I called the guy at USGS that was doing the work while we were preparing for this, because it had just been published, and he said that it was highly variable in that area, but there were places where there was a lot of erosion, but most of it was pretty moderate. But he said, their sampling their sampling that was done in order to support the study was very weak in that area. It wasn't very intensive, so they couldn't really definitively say one way or another. But there were places. Based on the conversations I had with some of the people from Wainwright's and the Inupiat, there were places where you could see the shoreline, where the shoreline receded, and there were a couple of houses that were built nearby, down by the village, that were in imminent threat of falling into the water. The Corps of Engineers, with some funds that came from the senior senator from Alaska, Ted Stevens, who was very good at this. It was a very, very expensive project to build a revetment in front of this thing. And when we were there, the sand behind the revetment was already going away. So this will be one of those places where, like many of the Shishmaref and a number of the villages in Alaska, where they're going to have to do something significant in order to stabilize it, or they're going to have to retreat. And there's not much of a place to retreat up there, because from the shoreline, from that point it becomes tundra, and with the loss of permafrost, it's very, very difficult to build anything inshore. The sand is good because you can build on sand. You can't build on permafrost. So there's going to be some significant problems there. In Barrow, there's a project going on right now where an Inuit burial ground is being eroded away near Point Barrow, and they're moving the remains to a more appropriate place. And the high school is actually involved with this, with an archaeologist helping to relocate, and they're reinterring and ceremonializing all of these people that are being moved from this burial ground. But again, it's an erosion caused by the storms and the open water that creates the fetch in there that makes the bigger waves. So it's a problem. Well, one more.
Are there any written accounts of some of the survivors' families, like the captains who had children and women? Are there any stories written by any of them?
Yeah, there was a very famous family that was, the captain was named Williams, and he was on the Monticello. He was captain of the Monticello, and his wife wrote a book called One Whaling Family that provides an account of their experiences in 1871. So, in this situation, and it was Just recently, I was approached by a family who had a journal from one of the, I think it was one of the mates on the Oceanic, that had a journal that no one had ever seen. And the family had it and they unearthed it. And I was able to broker a donation of that to the New Bedford Whaling Museum. So it's now available, and they're going through it and they're conserving it. And it's, that's another first person account, because it does, I had a chance to actually look at it, and it does have a section where he talks about the time that they were abandoning and all that stuff. It's fascinating stuff. But anyway, well, thank you all for holding on. I really appreciate it. Sorry to go long, but and as I say, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. Thank you so much.